The town of Ridgewood, Kansas held its silence the way a man holds his breath before a gunshot. It was said that in the summer of 1888, Sheriff Morgan Clay stood on the porch of his office with a child behind him and warriors on horseback before him, and that what he did in those moments decided whether blood would soak into the dust or whether something else, something harder to name, would take root instead. But the truth of what happened that day, and why it happened at all, remained locked behind the kind of silence that men carry to their graves. Some said the child was never there. Others said the child was there but shouldn't have been. And a few, those who watched from windows and doorways, said the look on Morgan Clay's face was not the look of a man protecting the law, but of a man protecting something he could not bear to lose. What no one disputed was this: when it was over, the town was different. And Morgan Clay was no longer the man they thought they knew. The year was 1888, and Ridgewood sat low and exposed on the western Kansas prairie like a camp that had forgotten to move on. The buildings leaned into the wind. The streets turned to rivers of mud when it rained and to clouds of pale dust when it did not. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon with no name painted on it, a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, and the sheriff's office, which was also the jail. 32 families called the town home, though that number shifted with the seasons and the fortunes of the railroad camps to the south. Morgan Clay had been sheriff for 6 years. He was a man in his middle 30s, lean and weathered, with a face that suggested he had seen more than he cared to remember. He wore his authority quietly. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his gun unless the moment left him no choice. The people of Ridgewood trusted him because he was steady, because he was fair, and because he had once talked down a man with a rifle in the saloon without a single shot being fired. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, kept to himself outside of his duties, and never spoke of where he had come from before Ridgewood. That spring, the town had been uneasy. The railroad was pushing farther west, and with it came the usual trouble: drifters, gamblers, men who had left their names behind in other territories. There were disputes over land, over water rights, over debts that had followed men across state lines. Morgan had handled it all with the same calm patience, but those who knew him well, men like Deputy Ben Hackett and the blacksmith Emil Vogt, noticed a certain weariness settling into him. He drank his coffee slower in the mornings. He stood on the porch longer in the evenings, looking out past the edge of town toward the open land. In late April, a supply wagon came through from Fort Larned, and with it came a man named Prout. He was a trader, round-faced and talkative, the kind of man who knew everyone's business and made it his own. He stayed 2 nights at the boarding house and spent both evenings in the saloon, buying drinks and telling stories. On the second night, he mentioned in passing that there had been trouble near the fort. A band of Cheyenne had been seen moving south, away from the reservation. The soldiers were tracking them, Prout said, but the mood was tense. Some of the younger warriors had refused to return. There were rumors of stolen horses, of threats made, of old grievances rising to the surface again. The men in the saloon listened without much reaction. It was not the first time such rumors had circulated, and most figured the army would settle it the way the army always did. But Morgan Clay, who had been sitting quietly at a corner table, set down his glass and left without a word. Ben Hackett, who had been playing cards nearby, watched him go and felt a faint unease he could not name. 3 days later, a boy arrived. He came in the back of a freight wagon driven by a Mexican hauler named Esteban, who made the run between Ridgewood and Dodge City twice a month. The boy was small, no more than 6 or 7, with dark hair and darker eyes and skin that marked him as something other than white. He wore clothes too large for him and sat silent in the back of the wagon with his knees pulled up to his chest. Esteban said he had found the boy walking alone on the trail south of town. No horse, no supplies, no explanation. The boy would not speak. He would not say his name, or where he had come from, or where he was going. Esteban brought him to the sheriff's office. Morgan Clay came out onto the porch and looked down at the child for a long moment. The boy stared back at him with an expression that was not fear exactly, but something closer to resignation. "He don't talk," Esteban said. "I tried English, I tried Spanish, nothing. But he follows, he eats, he understands some. I think maybe he's Cheyenne, maybe Arapaho." Morgan crouched down so he was level with the boy. He studied the child's face, the shape of his features, the way he held himself. Then he stood and told Esteban he would take care of it. Esteban asked no questions. He tipped his hat and climbed back onto his wagon and rolled out of town before noon. Morgan took the boy inside. He did not take him to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house. He did not ask the town council what should be done. He brought the boy to his own house, gave him water and bread, and let him sit by the stove in silence. The boy ate slowly, watching Morgan the entire time. When Morgan asked him his name, the boy did not answer. When Morgan asked where his family was, the boy looked away. That evening, Ben Hackett stopped by the house. He had heard about the boy, the way everyone in a small town hears about everything, and he wanted to know what Morgan planned to do. Morgan said he was still figuring that out. Ben looked at the boy, then back at Morgan, and asked if he thought the boy was from the band that had left the reservation. Morgan said he didn't know. Ben said maybe they should wire the fort, let the Indian agent know. Morgan said he would think about it, but he did not wire the fort. The boy stayed. Over the next 2 weeks, the child became a quiet fixture in Morgan Clay's life. He followed the sheriff to the office in the mornings, sat on a chair in the corner, watched the comings and goings of the town with those dark, unreadable eyes. Morgan gave him simple tasks, sweeping the floor, fetching water, stacking firewood. The boy did them without complaint. He still did not speak, but Morgan began to notice small things. The way the boy flinched at loud noises, the way he stood near the window when strangers approached, the way he watched the horizon as if expecting someone to appear. The people of Ridgewood did not know what to make of it. Some thought Morgan was doing a kindness, taking in a lost child until his people could be found. Others thought it was a mistake, that the boy would bring trouble, that keeping him was asking for complications no one needed. Mrs. Calloway said it was a Christian thing to do. Emil Vogt said it was a dangerous thing to do. The town waited, uncertain, while Morgan Clay went about his days as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Morgan was different. He was quieter, more distant. He spent less time in the saloon, less time in conversation. He seemed preoccupied, as though listening for something the rest of them could not hear. Ben Hackett asked him more than once if everything was all right, and each time Morgan said it was, but Ben did not believe him. One evening, sitting on the porch of the sheriff's office with the boy beside him, Morgan told Ben a story he had never told anyone before. He said that years ago, before Ridgewood, he had worked as a scout for the army down in Indian Territory. He had seen things that stayed with him, things he did not like to remember. He had seen families torn apart, children taken, men who fought because they had nothing left to lose. He said he had believed back then that he was doing the right thing. But time had a way of reshaping a man's certainties into doubts. Ben listened without interrupting. When Morgan finished, he asked why he was telling him this now. Morgan looked at the boy, then back at Ben, and said he wasn't sure. He just thought someone should know. The unease that had been simmering beneath the surface of Ridgewood began to sharpen. On a warm afternoon in mid-May, 2 Cheyenne men rode into town. They came from the north, moving slowly down the main street on painted horses, and they did not stop at the saloon or the general store. They rode directly to the sheriff's office. The town went still. People watched from windows and doorways, their hands hovering near whatever tools or weapons were within reach. The riders dismounted, and one of them, older and weathered with long graying hair, stepped onto the porch. Morgan Clay was inside. He heard the footsteps, the creak of the boards, and he knew before he looked up what had come for him. He walked to the door and opened it. The two men stood before him, silent and steady. The older one spoke in measured English, his accent thick but clear. He said they had been searching for a child, a boy who had been taken from their camp 3 weeks ago during a raid by horse thieves. They had tracked him south and east, following rumors and scraps of information, and they had heard that a boy matching his description had been seen in Ridgewood. He said they wanted the boy back. He said the boy belonged with his people. Morgan stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He asked how they knew the boy was here. The man said they had been told. By whom, he did not say. Morgan asked what proof they had that the boy was theirs. The man said the boy would know them. That was proof enough. Inside the office, behind the desk where Morgan could not see him, the boy sat motionless, listening. His hands gripped the edge of the chair. His breathing slowed. Morgan did not move. He did not invite the men inside. He said he would need time to verify their claim, that he could not simply hand over a child without knowing for certain where he belonged. The older man studied Morgan with eyes that had seen too many broken promises. He said they would wait, but not long. The two Cheyenne men rode to the edge of town and made camp within sight of the sheriff's office. They built no fire. They did not speak to anyone. They simply sat on their horses and watched. Word spread through Ridgewood like wind through dry grass. By nightfall, the saloon was full of anxious voices. Some men said Morgan should give the boy back and avoid trouble. Others said he should send for the army, let the soldiers handle it. A few said the boy was probably better off with the Indians anyway, that it was not the town's problem. Mrs. Calloway said the boy had been alone and frightened, and no one had the right to decide his fate without asking him what he wanted. But the boy still did not speak. Morgan Clay sat alone in his office long after dark, a lamp burning low on the desk. The boy was asleep in the back room, curled on a blanket Morgan had given him. Through the window, Morgan could see the faint shapes of the two riders in the distance, shadows against the prairie sky. Ben Hackett came in quietly and sat down across from him. He asked Morgan what he was going to do. Morgan did not answer right away. He stared at the lamp flame, his jaw tight. Then he said he didn't know if the men were telling the truth. He didn't know if the boy had been taken or if he had run. He didn't know if returning him would be mercy or cruelty. He only knew that the moment he made his choice, something would break that could not be put back together. Ben said that sometimes a man had to choose anyway. Morgan nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the flame. The next morning, more riders appeared. They came at dawn, 6 of them, young warriors with rifles slung across their backs and paint on their faces. They did not ride into town. They formed a line on the northern ridge, visible to everyone, a silent declaration that patience had its limits. The older man rode forward alone and stopped at the edge of the main street. He called out to Morgan Clay in a voice that carried across the stillness. He said the boy's name, and from inside the sheriff's office, for the first time since he had arrived, the child made a sound. A small, choked noise that might have been recognition or might have been fear. Morgan turned and saw the boy standing in the doorway of the back room, his face pale, his eyes wide and fixed on the riders beyond the window. Morgan stepped toward him, but the boy did not move. The silence between them was heavier than any words could have been. Outside, the town held its breath. The warriors sat motionless on the ridge. The older man waited. The morning stretched into afternoon, and still Morgan Clay had not moved from the porch. The boy remained inside, pressed against the back wall of the office where he could see the riders but they could not see him. The town waited. Women kept their children indoors. Men gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, checking rifles they hoped they would not need to use. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of tension that comes before storms. Ben Hackett stood beside Morgan, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, though he had not drawn it. He asked again what Morgan intended to do. Morgan said he needed to speak with the boy first, needed to understand what the child wanted. Ben said the boy had not spoken since he arrived, that waiting for words that might never come could cost them all dearly. Morgan said some things were worth the cost. The older Cheyenne man called out again, his voice patient but firm. He said the sun was moving, that the day would not last forever. He said they had come in peace but would not leave without the boy. Morgan stepped to the edge of the porch and called back that he needed until sundown, that he would give them an answer when the light began to fail. The man considered this, then nodded once and rode back to join the others on the ridge. Morgan went inside. He found the boy crouched in the corner, his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes fixed on nothing. Morgan sat down on the floor across from him, not too close, giving the child space. He spoke quietly, saying he knew the boy understood more than he let on, that he had seen the way the child listened, the way he responded to tone even when he did not respond to words. He said he would not force the boy to go, but he needed to know what had happened, needed to understand if the men outside were telling the truth. The boy's eyes flicked toward Morgan, then away. His lips moved, but no sound came. Morgan waited. The silence between them felt like something alive, something that needed to be handled with care. Finally, the boy reached out and touched Morgan's hand, just briefly, and then pulled back. It was not an answer, but it was something. Morgan nodded as if he understood. He stood and went to the desk, where he kept a pencil and paper for reports. He brought them back and set them in front of the boy. He said if the boy could not speak, perhaps he could draw, could show Morgan what he needed to know. The boy stared at the paper for a long time. Then slowly he picked up the pencil. What he drew was simple but clear. A group of figures on horseback, a smaller figure running fire. The images were crude, the lines uncertain, but the meaning was unmistakable. Morgan studied the drawing, his expression darkening. He asked if the men on the ridge were the ones who had taken him. The boy shook his head. He pointed to the running figure, then to himself. Morgan asked if he had been running away. The boy nodded. Morgan felt something shift inside him, a confirmation of what he had suspected but had not wanted to believe. He asked if the boy wanted to go back. The boy did not move. He stared at the drawing, then slowly, carefully, he drew another figure standing between the running child and the riders. He pointed to Morgan. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the sky. The warriors on the ridge sat motionless. The town remained locked in its uneasy stillness. By late afternoon, a rider arrived from the east. He was young, barely 20, with dust caked on his face and his horse lathered from hard riding. He dismounted in front of the general store and asked where he could find the sheriff. Someone pointed toward the office. The rider walked quickly, his urgency clear. When he reached the porch, Morgan stepped out to meet him. The young man said his name was Peterson, that he worked as a courier for the territorial marshal's office. He said he had been sent to warn the towns in the region that a band of Cheyenne men had left the reservation without authorization, that the army was tracking them, and that any settlements in their path should exercise caution. He said the group was believed to be searching for something, though the details were unclear. When Morgan asked how many men, Peterson said reports varied, but at least 8 or 10. Morgan looked toward the ridge and counted 7 visible riders, close enough. Peterson noticed the warriors for the first time and his face went pale. He asked if they had made demands. Morgan said they had. Peterson asked if Morgan had sent for help. Morgan said he had not. Peterson said he should, that the army would be here within 2 days if word was sent now. Morgan thanked him for the information but did not move toward the telegraph office. Peterson stared at him, confused, then asked if the sheriff understood the danger. Morgan said he understood it better than most. After Peterson left, riding south to warn the next settlement, Ben Hackett pulled Morgan aside. He said the town was looking to him for leadership, that people were frightened, that if he did not act soon, someone else would. Morgan asked what Ben thought he should do. Ben said the honest answer was that he did not know, but doing nothing was the same as choosing a side, and choosing the wrong side could get people hurt. Morgan said he was aware of that. He said he had been aware of it from the moment the boy arrived. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Morgan made his decision. He told Ben to gather the men who could be trusted to keep their heads, to arm themselves but to stay inside, to watch but not to provoke. He said he was going to walk out to the ridge and speak with the Cheyenne men directly, and he was going to bring the boy with him. Ben said that was a mistake, that bringing the boy out would force a confrontation. Morgan said the confrontation was already here. All he could do now was try to control how it ended. He went inside and found the boy still sitting by the wall. He crouched down and told him what he planned to do, that he would not hand him over against his will, but that the men outside deserved to speak their piece, and the boy deserved to hear it. He said if the boy wanted to stay, Morgan would stand between him and anyone who tried to take him. But if the boy chose to go, Morgan would not stop him. It had to be the boy's choice. The child looked at Morgan for a long time, his dark eyes searching the sheriff's face for something he could trust. Then, slowly, he stood. Morgan held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, the boy took it. They walked out onto the porch together. The town watched from behind closed doors and shuttered windows. The warriors on the ridge straightened, their attention sharpening. Morgan and the boy descended the steps and began walking north, toward the edge of town, toward the line of riders silhouetted against the fading light. When they reached the place where the grass began and the street ended, the older Cheyenne man rode forward to meet them. He dismounted and stood a few paces away, his eyes moving from Morgan to the boy. He spoke softly, in a language Morgan did not understand, and the boy's grip on Morgan's hand tightened. The man spoke again, his tone gentle, almost pleading. The boy did not respond. The man switched back to English. He said the boy's name was Small Crow, that his mother had died 2 winters ago, that his father had been killed by soldiers the year before that. He said the boy had been living with his uncle's family, but that the camp had been attacked by white men looking for horses, and in the chaos the boy had run. He said they had been searching for him ever since, that his family was waiting, that he was loved and wanted. He said the boy belonged with his people, that no matter how kindly the white sheriff treated him, this town would never be his home. Morgan listened without interrupting. When the man finished, Morgan looked down at the boy and asked if what the man said was true. The boy did not answer, but tears had begun to streak his face. Morgan asked if the boy had family waiting. The boy nodded, almost imperceptibly. Morgan asked if he was afraid to go back. The boy nodded again. Morgan turned to the older man and asked why the boy was afraid. The man's expression tightened. He said the boy was young, that he had seen violence, that fear was natural. But he did not answer the question. Morgan asked again, his voice harder. He said if the boy was running from something, he had a right to know what it was. The man was silent for a long moment. Then, with visible reluctance, he said there had been talk in the camp after the raid, that the boy had brought bad fortune, that his presence had drawn the white men's attention. Some of the younger men had spoken harshly. The boy had heard. The man said it was only talk, that no harm would come to him, but Morgan could see the doubt in the man's eyes, the uncertainty that he could not quite mask. Morgan looked back at the boy, at the way he stood frozen between 2 worlds, neither of which promised safety. He thought of his own past, of the choices he had made that still haunted him, of the children he had seen caught in the machinery of conflicts they did not create and could not escape. He thought of what it meant to protect someone and what it cost. He made his choice. He told the older man that the boy would stay in Ridgewood until he was ready to speak for himself, until he could say clearly what he wanted and where he felt he belonged. He said the man and his companions were welcome to make camp near the town, to visit the boy, to let him see that they meant him no harm, but he would not force the child to leave. Not yet, not like this. The man's face hardened. He said Morgan did not have the right to make that choice, that the boy was not his. Morgan said the boy was not anyone's, that a child was not property to be claimed, and that he would defend that principle with whatever force was necessary. The two men stood facing each other in the failing light, the distance between them measured in more than feet. Then, unexpectedly, one of the younger warriors called out from the ridge. The older man turned, and a brief exchange followed in their own language. The warrior gestured toward the south, and Morgan followed his gaze to see dust rising on the horizon. Riders, moving fast, too many to be another courier. The army had come. The older man looked back at Morgan with something like resignation. He said they would not fight soldiers, not over one boy, not when it would mean the deaths of men who had families waiting for them. He said they would leave, but that they would return, and that Small Crow's people would not forget him. He mounted his horse, and the others followed. They rode north, away from the approaching soldiers, and within minutes they were gone, swallowed by the prairie and the coming dark. Morgan stood with the boy, watching them disappear. The child's hand was still in his, but the grip had loosened. When Morgan looked down, he saw that the boy was crying, not from fear now, but from something more complicated, something that had no easy name. The soldiers arrived an hour later, led by a lieutenant named Farrow, who demanded to know if Morgan had seen the Cheyenne men, and why he had not detained them. Morgan said he had no authority to detain anyone who had committed no crime, and that the men had left peacefully. Farrow said harboring an Indian child without notifying the agency was a violation of territorial law. Morgan said the child had been abandoned, that he had acted within his authority as sheriff, and that if Farrow wanted to take the matter up with the territorial judge, he was welcome to do so. Farrow looked at the boy, then back at Morgan, his frustration evident. He said this was not over, that Morgan would hear from his superiors. Morgan said he looked forward to it. The soldiers made camp outside town, and by morning they were gone, riding north to continue their pursuit of the band that had already vanished. The town of Ridgewood slowly exhaled. People emerged from their homes, conversations resumed, life returned to something like normal. But the boy remained, and his presence became a question that no one quite knew how to answer. In the days that followed, Mrs. Calloway took it upon herself to teach the boy to read. She said every child deserved an education, regardless of where he came from. Emil Vogt carved him a small wooden horse, which the boy carried with him everywhere. The children of the town, after their initial wariness, began to include him in their games. He still did not speak, but he smiled occasionally, and that seemed like progress. Morgan continued his duties as sheriff, but the weight of what had happened stayed with him. He knew the situation was not resolved, only delayed. The territorial authorities would want answers. The boy's family, wherever they were, would want him back. And Morgan himself was caught in the middle, aware that his actions, however well-intentioned, had set events in motion that he might not be able to control. 2 weeks later, word came that the Cheyenne band had been found and escorted back to the reservation. No shots had been fired. No one had been hurt. It was considered a successful resolution, but the boy remained in Ridgewood and no one from the agency came to claim him. Summer turned to autumn. The boy began to speak, haltingly at first, then with more confidence. He told Morgan his name, confirmed what the older man had said, and spoke of his mother in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. He did not speak of his uncle or the men who had come for him. When Morgan asked if he wanted to return to the reservation, the boy said he did not know. Morgan said that was all right, that he did not need to decide yet. But the town council did not share Morgan's patience. They called a meeting in October and invited Morgan to attend. They said the boy's presence was creating complications, that there were questions about his legal status, about who was responsible for him, about what would happen when he was older. Some members argued that the humane thing was to send him to a mission school, where he could be educated and prepared for life in white society. Others said he should be returned to his people, that keeping him was prolonging an inevitable separation. Morgan listened to it all and then said the boy would stay until he chose otherwise. The council was not pleased, but they did not overrule him. Not yet. Winter came, and with it a kind of uneasy peace. The boy attended lessons with Mrs. Calloway, helped Morgan with his work, and became a familiar sight on the streets of Ridgewood. But there were always whispers, always sidelong glances, always the unspoken awareness that he was different, that he did not quite belong. In the spring of 1889, a man arrived in town asking questions. He was a clerk from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, tasked with locating children who had been removed from reservations and ensuring they were properly documented. He interviewed Morgan, examined the boy, and took extensive notes. He said the boy would need to be enrolled in the agency's records, that his legal guardian would need to be established, and that without proper documentation, Morgan's custody could be challenged. Morgan said he would handle it. The clerk said he hoped so, because there were parties interested in the boy's welfare, and if Morgan could not demonstrate that he was acting in the child's best interest, the agency would intervene. Morgan asked what parties. The clerk said he was not at liberty to say. He left the next morning, and Morgan felt the clock begin to tick. The boy, now 8 years old and more confident in his English, asked Morgan what would happen to him. Morgan said he did not know, but that he would do everything he could to make sure the boy had a choice in his own future. The boy asked if Morgan would let him go if he wanted to leave. Morgan said yes. The boy asked if Morgan wanted him to stay. Morgan hesitated, then said yes to that as well. In June, a letter arrived from the territorial judge. It stated that Morgan's guardianship of the boy was being reviewed, that a hearing would be held in August, and that Morgan would need to present evidence that his care of the child was in accordance with the law and in the child's best interest. Failure to do so could result in the boy being removed and placed in the custody of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Morgan read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in his desk. He did not tell the boy. He did not tell Ben Hackett. He carried the knowledge alone, the way he carried most things. July brought drought and heat. The crops struggled. Tempers grew short. A fight broke out in the saloon over a card game, and Morgan had to lock up 2 men for the night. The boy watched it all with the careful attention of someone learning how the world worked, how men decided what was right and what was worth fighting for. On a Thursday evening, as the sun set red and low, the boy asked Morgan why he had not let the Cheyenne men take him. Morgan thought for a long time before answering. He said it was because the boy had been afraid, and because Morgan believed that fear meant something, that it was a kind of truth that deserved to be listened to. He said he had made mistakes in his life, had followed orders and enforced laws that he later came to question, and that he had decided, perhaps too late, that some things mattered more than obedience. He said he did not know if he had made the right choice, but it was the only choice he could live with. The boy asked if Morgan regretted it. Morgan said no. But there was something in his voice that suggested the answer was more complicated than the word. The hearing never took place. In late July, a telegram arrived from the Bureau stating that the boy's uncle had died of illness, that his remaining family had relocated to a different reservation, and that after consultation with tribal representatives, it had been decided that the boy could remain in Morgan's care provided he continued to receive appropriate education and supervision. The decision felt less like a resolution than a bureaucratic shrug, but it was enough. The boy would stay. Ridgewood settled back into its rhythms. The boy grew. He learned to ride, to read, to navigate the unspoken rules of a town that had accepted him without fully understanding him. Morgan Clay continued as sheriff, his reputation now tinged with something more complex than simple competence. Some saw him as a man of principle. Others saw him as a man who had overstepped. Most simply saw him as the sheriff, and that was enough. Years passed. The boy became a young man. He took the surname Clay, though no formal adoption was ever filed. He worked as a deputy for a time, then left Ridgewood to attend a teacher's college in the East, funded by a small inheritance Morgan had quietly set aside. He wrote letters, irregular but affectionate, and Morgan kept every one. The story of that day in 1888, when Morgan Clay stood on the porch with a child behind him and warriors before him, became part of Ridgewood's history. It was told in different ways depending on who was telling it, the details shifting, the meaning debated. Some said Morgan had defied the law. Others said he had embodied it. A few said it did not matter, that what mattered was that a frightened child had been given a choice, and that was rare enough to be worth remembering. Morgan Clay served as sheriff until 1903, when age and weariness finally convinced him to step down. He lived quietly in his small house at the edge of town, tending a garden, reading books borrowed from Mrs. Calloway, watching the world change in ways he did not always understand. He died in the winter of 1911 and was buried in the Ridgewood Cemetery under a simple stone that bore his name and nothing more. The boy, now a man named Samuel Clay, returned for the funeral. He stood beside the grave in a suit he had bought in Chicago, his face weathered but his eyes still sharp. He did not speak at the service, but afterward he walked to the sheriff's office, which was now occupied by a younger man he did not know, and he stood on the porch where Morgan had once stood and looked out at the town that had become his home by accident and choice. The years continued. Ridgewood shrank as the railroad shifted its routes. The buildings aged and leaned farther, families left, new ones arrived. The story of Morgan Clay and the boy faded into the kind of local legend that old men tell in the saloon, half remembered and half invented. But in 1967, a graduate student named Ellen Forrester arrived in what remained of Ridgewood, researching her dissertation on frontier law enforcement. She was given access to the old sheriff's records, kept in a dusty storage room in the courthouse basement. Among the incident reports and arrest logs, she found a folder marked only with the year 1888 inside was a single sheet of paper, a drawing in pencil, faded but still visible. It showed a group of riders, a running child, and a figure standing between them. Ellen stared at the drawing for a long time. She traced the story through census records, letters, and newspaper archives. She found references to Samuel Clay, a teacher who had worked in Indian schools across 3 states, who had written articles advocating for the rights of Native children in the education system, who had lived a long and quiet life, dedicated to ensuring that others had the choices he had been given. She found his obituary in a 1958 newspaper, noting that he was survived by 2 daughters and a son, all of whom carried his name. She included the story in her dissertation, and later in a book that was published in 1972. It was not a bestseller, but it was read by people who cared about such things, and the story of Morgan Clay and the boy found a new life, small but persistent, in the archives of Western history. In 2003, one of Samuel Clay's granddaughters donated a collection of family papers to the Kansas State Historical Society. Among them was a letter, written in 1910, in which Samuel described the day he had arrived in Ridgewood, the fear he had felt, and the man who had stood between him and a future he could not face. He wrote that he had never fully understood why Morgan Clay had made the choice he did, but that he had spent his life trying to be worthy of it. The letter was preserved, catalogued, and filed, and the story, like all true stories, continued to be told. End the truth, when it finally came, arrived not with thunder but with the whisper of turning pages in a library 600 miles from where the events had unfolded. It was 2019, and a researcher named David Kern was cataloging a collection of military correspondence from the 1880s for the National Archives. He was not looking for anything in particular, just doing the methodical work of preservation, when he found a letter dated September 1888, written by a Captain Morris Hendricks of Fort Larned to his commanding officer. The letter had been misfiled, tucked into a folder of routine supply requisitions, which was likely why it had escaped notice for more than a century. In it, Captain Hendricks described an incident involving a civilian trader named Prout, who had been caught selling rifles to Cheyenne men living off the reservation. During questioning, Prout had mentioned that he had information about a missing Indian child, a boy who had been taken during a raid conducted not by horse thieves, as officially reported, but by a group of white men Prout himself had supplied with weapons. The raid had been orchestrated to provoke a response from the Cheyenne, to create an excuse for military action that would force the band back onto the reservation and allow Prout and his associates to claim mineral rights on disputed land. The boy, Prout said, had witnessed the attack. He had seen the faces of the men involved, and rather than kill a child, which even they had found distasteful, they had left him on the trail hoping he would die of exposure or be found by someone who would ask no questions. When the boy survived and was taken in by the sheriff of Ridgewood, Prout had grown nervous. He had been the one to alert the Cheyenne men to the boy's location, hoping they would retrieve the child before he could speak to the wrong people, but the plan had failed. The boy had remained in Ridgewood, and Prout had disappeared into the territories, never to be seen again. Captain Hendricks had recommended further investigation, but the letter bore a stamp indicating it had been received and noted, then apparently filed away and forgotten. The official record contained no follow-up, no arrests were made, no land claims were contested. The matter, it seemed, had been quietly buried beneath the weight of bureaucratic indifference, and the assumption that the word of a corrupt traitor was insufficient to pursue white men of standing. David Kern read the letter 3 times. He cross-referenced the names, the dates, the locations. He found the mention of Ridgewood, the reference to a sheriff named Clay, and he began to trace the story backward through time. He found Ellen Forrester's book from 1972. He found Samuel Clay's obituary. He found the drawing in the Kansas Historical Archives, and slowly, piece by piece, the full picture emerged. Morgan Clay had not known the complete truth in 1888, but he had known enough. He had known that something was wrong, that the boy's fear was rooted in more than simple displacement. He had known that the men who came for the boy were sincere, but that sincerity did not mean safety. And he had known, perhaps most importantly, that the law as written did not always align with justice as it should be. Kern published his findings in a historical journal in 2020. The article was titled The Ridgewood Incident: Child, Sheriff, and the Failure of Frontier Justice. It was thorough, carefully argued, and deeply sympathetic to Morgan Clay's position. It concluded that Clay had likely saved the boy's life, not from his own people, but from being returned to a situation where his knowledge made him a liability. The article was read by historians, by archivists, by the handful of people who still cared about the details of forgotten frontier towns. One of those readers was a woman named Grace Madsen, a great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Clay. She had known the general outline of the family story, the tale of her ancestor being taken in by a Kansas sheriff, but she had not known the details, had not understood the stakes. When she read Kern's article, she felt something shift in her understanding of her own history. She contacted Kern, and together they began to assemble a fuller account. Grace provided family letters, photographs, and stories passed down through generations. Kern contributed his research, his context, his careful reconstruction of events. They discovered that Samuel Clay had returned to Kansas only twice after leaving for college, once for Morgan's funeral, and once in 1924, when he attended the dedication of a school built on the outskirts of what had once been the reservation. At that dedication, Samuel had given a brief speech. No transcript survived, but a newspaper account summarized his remarks. He had spoken about the importance of education, about the need for children to have choices, and about a man he had known who had believed that the law was only as good as the people willing to stand behind it. He had not mentioned Morgan by name, but those who knew the story understood who he meant. Grace and Kern compiled their findings into a book published in 2022 titled Standing Between: Morgan Clay and the Choice That Defined a Life. It was a modest success, read primarily in academic circles and by descendants of Ridgewood families. But it brought renewed attention to the story, and to the questions it raised about justice, authority, and the decisions people make when institutions fail. The book prompted the Kansas Historical Society to create a small exhibit about Morgan Clay and Samuel Clay, displayed in the State Museum in Topeka. The exhibit included the original drawing, photographs of Ridgewood, excerpts from letters, and a timeline of events. It was placed in a quiet corner of the museum, not prominently featured, but present for those who took the time to look. Among the visitors to the exhibit over the years that followed were teachers looking for material to inspire their students, descendants of other frontier families tracing their own histories, and occasionally, people who simply wandered through and paused, caught by the image of a child's drawing and the story it represented. One such visitor in the spring of 2024 was an elderly man named Thomas Rainwater. He stood before the exhibit for a long time, leaning on a cane, his weathered face thoughtful. A museum docent, noticing his interest, asked if he had a connection to the story. Thomas said his grandmother had been Cheyenne, from the same band that had left the reservation in 1888. He said she had told him stories about those days, about the soldiers, about the children who were lost and found and lost again. He said she had mentioned a boy who had been taken in by a white man, a boy who had lived between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. The docent asked if he knew what had become of the boy. Thomas said he knew the boy had become a teacher, that he had spent his life trying to help other children navigate the spaces between cultures. He said he thought that was the best anyone could hope for, to take what had been done to you and turn it into something that might help someone else. Before he left, Thomas wrote a note in the exhibit's guest book. It read, "My grandmother said the boy's name meant something about crossing distances. I think he did that his whole life, so did the sheriff." The note remained in the guest book, and was later transcribed into the museum's records. Back in what remained of Ridgewood, which by 2024 was little more than a handful of houses and a historical marker, there were still people who remembered the stories. The town had never recovered from the economic shifts of the mid-20th century. The railroad had moved, the farms had consolidated, and the young people had left. But a few families remained, keeping the school open for a handful of children, maintaining the small church, preserving what they could of the past. One of those families was the Vogts, descendants of Emil the blacksmith. The current generation, a couple named Raymond and Clara, ran a small museum in what had been the old general store. It was a volunteer effort, funded by donations and the occasional grant. They displayed artifacts from Ridgewood's history, old tools, photographs, newspapers, and a replica of the sheriff's badge that Morgan Clay had worn. They also displayed, in a glass case by the window, the original wooden horse that Emil Vogt had carved for Samuel Clay in 1888. It had been returned to the town by one of Samuel's descendants in 2015, a gesture of connection to a place that had shaped her ancestor's life. The horse was small, worn smooth by handling, and it sat on a faded cloth next to a placard explaining its history. Visitors to the museum were few, but those who came often spent time with that display, drawn by the simplicity of the object and the complexity of the story behind it. Raymond Vogt, when asked about it, would say that his great-great-grandfather had believed in doing small kindnesses, that he had not thought about history or legacy, only about a frightened child who needed something to hold on to. Raymond said he thought that was the point of the whole story, that the big moments everyone remembered were built on small gestures nobody noticed at the time. In 2025, a filmmaker named Alicia Torres began work on a documentary about forgotten stories of the American West. She had read Grace Madsen and David Kern's book, and she reached out to interview descendants, historians, and anyone connected to the Ridgewood incident. She traveled to Kansas, filmed the museum, recorded interviews with the Vogts, and spent a day at the Historical Society in Topeka. She also tracked down two of Samuel Clay's great-grandchildren, now in their 60s, living in different states. Both agreed to be interviewed. They spoke about their ancestor with a mixture of pride and sadness, aware that his life had been shaped by trauma, but also by the refusal of one man to look away when it would have been easier to do so. One of them, a woman named Judith, said that Samuel had told her once, near the end of his life, that he remembered very little of the day the Cheyenne men came to Ridgewood, but he remembered the feeling of Morgan Clay's hand holding his, and the steadiness of it. She said Samuel had told her that sometimes a person's whole life could turn on a moment of steadiness, and that he had tried to offer that to his own students whenever he could. The documentary premiered at a regional film festival in 2026. It was well received, praised for its quiet, contemplative approach and its refusal to simplify the moral complexities of the story. It did not assign villains or heroes. It did not offer easy answers. It simply presented the events, the people, and the choices, and let viewers sit with the discomfort of not knowing what they would have done in Morgan Clay's place. The film brought another wave of attention to Ridgewood, brief but meaningful. A few dozen people made the trip to see the town, to stand where the sheriff's office had been, to visit the cemetery where Morgan Clay was buried. His grave, once marked only by a simple stone, now had a small plaque placed by the Historical Society, noting his service and the events of 1888. It did not glorify him. It simply stated the facts and let them speak. Samuel Clay's grave, in a cemetery in Iowa where he had spent his final years, received a similar plaque placed by his descendants. And slowly, the story settled into its place in the quiet archive of American history, not famous, not forgotten, but preserved for those who went looking. In the end, what remained was not certainty but questions. Had Morgan Clay made the right choice? Was keeping the boy an act of protection or an act of paternalism? Would Samuel have been better off returned to his people, even with the dangers that might have entailed? Could justice and law ever fully align, or was there always a gap that required individual conscience to bridge? These questions had no single answer, and perhaps that was the point. The story of Morgan Clay and Samuel Clay was not a parable with a clear moral. It was simply a story about people trying to do right in a world that made right hard to define, about a child caught between forces beyond his control, and about a man who chose to stand between that child and the machinery of history, knowing it might cost him everything and uncertain if it would matter at all. What could be said with certainty was that Samuel Clay had lived. He had grown, learned, taught, and loved. He had raised children who raised children, and his line continued. He had made choices of his own, built a life of his own, and in doing so, he had honored the choice Morgan Clay made on that hot day in 1888 when the town of Ridgewood held its breath and waited to see which way the future would break. And Morgan Clay, who had carried his doubts to the grave, had left behind something more durable than certainty. The example of a man who, when the moment came, chose the harder kindness, the uncertain mercy, the risk that comes with treating another person not as a problem to be solved, but as a life to be honored. The prairie wind still blew across the site where Ridgewood once stood. The buildings were gone, the streets reclaimed by grass, the voices silent. But the story remained, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, a testament to the truth that history is made not by those who follow the rules, but by those willing to question them when a child's life hangs in the balance. In the end, perhaps that was the only legacy that mattered, that when it counted, someone stood between and held steady, and gave a frightened boy the one thing the law could not provide, a choice. The sun set over Kansas as it always had, indifferent and eternal, and the story became part of the land, quiet and deep, like all the best truths of the West.